All right. Oh, is this on? Okay. Sorry for the delay there. Thank you so much for returning. And I'm really excited now because you will hear less of me and less of us on the PolicyEngine side. You'll hear more from our users, such as Max Mosley and Malcolm Torrey, and also some more of the applied use cases. So, the first half was really about here's the infrastructure we're building for policy research, and now you'll get to see it in action. And then toward the end, you'll also hear from Anvar and Aaron Advani in a panel discussion. And finally, we'll close with our future direction, especially as we're thinking about how AI can continue to push forward this rocket fuel of more advanced policy research. So I'd love to welcome up Max Mosley from the New Economics Foundation to talk about how he used PolicyEngine in the NISR's Living Standards Review. Max, thank you.
Thank you. So just some housekeeping first. I used to work at the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, which is the product of the research you're about to see, now at a slightly new place with a shorter name. So just to, clear that up. Some background is, when I started at NISA, so 2021, it was the start of the cost of living crisis, and people like me were in charge of doing lots of analysis into looking into the effect of different policy interventions on resolving that crisis. I was handed our internal model, which will remain nameless, but would take 5 days to run. Would produce 64 different spreadsheets, which is then up to the user to then put together again to try and understand whether they made a mistake and have to run that model again for another 5 days. You get the impression that it is essentially unwieldy and not very optimized for the researcher. And was told as a junior person that I would have to learn the code and the very detailed parameters of this incredibly complicated model to be able to perform fairly standard analysis at a pace that is trying to keep up with a very fast-moving media cycle. So you get the impression that it's not really possible and it's not exactly what I got into research to do. I wanted to focus on the outcomes, not the sort of inputs. So one day I was talking to somebody from Centax, who I'm told is going to be here shortly, and was ranting to him about this exact problem. And he said, well, why don't you talk to these guys at PolicyEngine? 3 years later, we've now had a lot of research together. And while I was doing a big project into sort of putting all those stories together about the drivers of people's living standards, it felt right to sort of use this model as an opportunity to show the impact of lots of different policy options. And what I'm going to show you today is the produce of that. So I'm going to show you the sort of context of the research that we were doing, and then right at the end you'll see exactly how PolicyEngine slotted in perfectly to answer questions that wouldn't have necessarily been possible with the slightly more conventional models. Are we missing the slides? About to go to Malcolm. Yes. It's all right. Sorry, this is my fault for sending them late. Being at a think tank, I am very used to waffling without any substance or research behind me. So I'll just add a little bit more detail into that, which is to say that oftentimes these microsimulation models that are of good substance and can help you do the research that you want to do are dynamic, that can account for those behavioral effects, because often we want to show the impact of something that's beneficial to people's standard of living, so it's a good positive effect on their income, that will have positive feedback effects that will then create more money for them in the future. So we don't want to underestimate these results, and it's why it's really important to use these dynamic models. But too often, as soon as it becomes dynamic, it suddenly becomes incredibly complicated to use. So this is why this kind of approach is really interesting, because it not only is fast, as you saw earlier with the demonstration. I was finding it really interesting how the presenter was showing, saying, oh, this is going to take ages, and it took, what, 10, 20 seconds? Somebody who's used to doing this in 5 days. That was really good to see. But yeah, so with those dynamic models, you often find that they just take too long to run, and as a result, you're sort of missing out on lots of different opportunities. Give an example that one of the models that I was using internally for dynamic microsimulation would have to make an assumption about who in the sample would get married, and who in the sample it would get married to. So that is the degree of which it would have to go into detail, which hence why it takes 5 days to run. There we are. Okay, so this is from NISA, but with NEF colors now for organizational reasons. I'm going to fly through fairly fast the sort of context behind the full research. If anybody has anything that's burning to them and they want to ask a question about, please do just raise your hand. Some of these stories are going to be very familiar to you, which is including this one. A huge story that we would be covering was about the stagnating real income growth, which you can see here. So, for nearly half a century, real incomes in the UK, which is basically people's interpretation of their own standard of living, that would rise every single year. And then after 2008, you saw a sort of marked decline. So the project that we had funding for was to really delve into why that was the case, the consequence of it, and as you will start to get a flavor of, what we can do about it. So this is that showed in a slightly more specific way by looking at not just different countries and how we compare in terms of our own standard of living, but looking at that regionally. And you can see here that countries often come in block colors. You don't get an awful lot of variation, unlike the UK, which has quite a lot of variation in terms of people's standard of living. This is in 2010, and I want you to watch very closely what happens to the UK as I move it on to 2021. So that divergence gets a little bit more extreme, and we're comparing this to Europe. I'm actually going to go back again to 2010. This time I want you to look at Eastern Europe, in particular Poland, and you will see when I move it to 2021, you see an increase in people's standard of living, in particular in the sort of inner city areas. So clearly something's going on that's specific to the UK that is worth delving into, and that's what our project's going to do. I'm going to slightly skip over this, so it just shows this in a slightly different way, seeing that the growth for particular regions puts the UK regions towards the bottom and Eastern European regions at the top. And you may have seen a headline when we put this research out in March that focused on this story, which was that the standard of living in the UK was falling behind that of Slovenia and Malta. No disrespect to Slovenia and Malta. We don't have the right to be objectively better off, but that is a sort of very particular trend that we've observed over recent years. So we're going to delve into the sort of components of income in this project to look at welfare and wages. So welfare, just as some context, despite what you might read in the media, the UK is not necessarily a high welfare country when we look at this as a percentage of GDP. This accounts for mostly pensions, but also other unemployment benefits. So you can see here that our sort of makeup is fairly similar to the rest of Europe, but the overall spending is a fair amount lower. And that matters because one of the reasons for that is that there's been quite a sharp fall since 2010. So over the 2010 period, you see a slight reduction, well, a pretty extreme reduction actually, in overall welfare spending, where in lots of other countries you might have seen an increase. It's not objectively the case that if you are spending more on welfare that is therefore a sort of good outcome, but just putting that into context as that particular policy choices have resulted in this overall change. And here's where it gets a little bit more interesting for the particular claimant. So here we look at a replacement rate, which is your average welfare by your average wage. That would look like if you're earning the average wage in the UK, you lose a job and you end up on welfare. How much of your previous wage was covered by your unemployment benefits, a bit like the strength of your insurance. The UK is, again, at the bottom of that distribution, and the shaded area there shows you the fall since 2010. So it's showing that the particular policy choices have reduced generosity for particular claimants and reduced the overall welfare bill as a percent of GDP. This is a slightly interesting context, which is a bit surprising. So this is just looking at the value of welfare over time from 2000, and you'll see that the introduction of universal credit actually increased the cash value of welfare. So how can those two things be true at the same time? How can the welfare bill be falling if the individual benefit is increasing? The answer is because it was pushing a lot of people off welfare harsher. So that an increase in conditionality may have meant that people who are no longer eligible for universal credit, but those who are eligible would have seen a small increase. So that's the slight dichotomy in those two things. This is the Joseph Rowntree Foundation's Essentials Guarantee, just putting this into context. The resulting effect of deteriorating value of welfare over time is that it will then, the cost of essentials will outstrip your universal credit. So looking at that again over time, so that was just in the last year, you'll see that trend here. So although the universal credit uplift in 2020 meant it was possible to afford the essentials on universal credit, that story is not necessarily true for the 2010. So even though you saw that increase, conditionality and the fact that it's not necessarily covering the essentials apart from one particular moment means that it is particularly difficult to live on universal credit. Not hugely surprising to people who do this kind of research on a day-to-day basis, but would be surprising if you read particular newspapers. Now just delving into some slightly more macro topics, but it will become relevant as to why, because there's a slight plea for PolicyEngine to include some more of this stuff, because this is the sort of top-level economic stuff, which is often not included in microsimulation, but I'm going to show you why it'd be very helpful to do that in the future. This is that same story again. Instead of looking at incomes, we're now just going to focus specifically on wages, where you see a really that trend really pronounced, which was the pre-2008 trend and the sort of fall since. I mean, this is I've chopped out the bit from 1950 onwards up to here, but you take my word for it. It was steadily increasing up until 2008, and then stops. The reason we're looking at this now is because we want to try and explain that fall from trend, and the answer as to why there is that very pronounced stagnation is productivity. So I hope you can see this well. But here we're looking at the relationship between real wage growth and productivity growth over the 2010s. So what that shows you is that the countries in the top right corner, like Romania and Poland, had the strongest increase in productivity, labor productivity, and consequently the strongest increase in real wages. It shows that this is like the primary driver for people's standard of living, and is often overlooked because of complexity. So going back to that story, that trend you can see here, we estimated that nearly half of that fall from trend is explained by labor productivity. So just that one factor alone costs workers around £4,300 a year. So just add some more context to this, given that there's a lot of Americans in the room, we are going to just bring this to life to show you that if we had US-level wage growth, so driven by their increase in productivity, you would see that very similar trend following that productivity factor. So this is a real story of productivity on people's standard of living. So putting all this research together in this sort of very long introduction into what we use PolicyEngine for, you can see here that the UK is neither a high wage nor a high welfare country. So the two sort of primary sources for your standard of living are sort of inherently constrained. So what do we do about it? Now, there's lots of talk about retail cost of living policies that this government are particularly keen on trying to understand so that they can pick one and influence people's standard of living. The other issue is public finances aren't in a particularly brilliant place, so this cost-benefit analysis of how do we influence people's standard of living at the lowest cost possible is a fairly live debate that we wanted to contribute to. Now, what I wanted to do was to show a whole list of those retail cost of living policies, the impact on living standards and the cost. But like I said earlier, with the kind of models that are available to researchers, that would be a years-long project. Just by definition, you want to do 10 different policy areas, you have to design each one of them, you have to run it, sense check it, and then produce all that analysis. So it's a huge undertaking. But with PolicyEngine, we did this in half an hour. So what you're looking at here is a whole suite of policies. I hope you can read them, but I'll read a couple out to you. You see the mouse here? Yeah, so this one is the Essentials Guarantee. This is the Joseph Rowntree Foundation's estimate for what people need to receive to be able to cover the cost of essentials. And that shows you that it does have a pretty substantial impact on reducing poverty, but it's quite expensive. And by comparison, removing the two-child limit that we've heard a lot about today is in that sort of more cost-effective quadrant. So actually it's a little bit more effective at reducing poverty, but costs a lot less. We include a whole other range here, from tax cuts to other welfare changes. The winter fuel allowance is included. And you can immediately gain insight here into which policies are able to achieve the thing that I want to do and which one of them is the most cost-effective at doing so. I think this may seem particularly obvious as a piece of analysis, but this kind of stuff doesn't exist because doing the analysis on every single one of those bits of policy parameters is often too inaccessible to a researcher. But with PolicyEngine, it is incredibly possible. So here I'm just going to move on to income, and this is the final slide. This is slightly more mechanical because we're talking about overall income, so the larger the transfer from government to individuals, obviously the higher it will be. So you don't get the slightly more cost-effective shape that you did in the previous one, because poverty is a bit more of a construct of your own individual circumstances. But still here you can get an insight into which one is the most effective. So if you're a minister or even the chancellor and you get presented with a chart like this, and you were previously talking about changes to VAT, you might suddenly take a slightly different view because you see the impact that that would have on people's income by comparison to lots of other policies. This is why this tool is really powerful. So I'll finish where I start, which is that this is a way in which we can do the kind of analysis that is previously impossible. The thing that's missing here, which I'm really interested to see where it goes next, is that macro story that I mentioned earlier, because a lot of questions that we get is, okay, yeah, but you showed us that the macro side, the productivity story, is the most important for understanding people's real incomes today. So hopefully in the future, with some more funding, PolicyEngine will be able to sort of explore that part of it, because at the moment, our microsimulation world is so dominated by particular policy choices. From our perspective, from a researcher's perspective, oftentimes we want to look at sort of more economic parameters to see how that intersects with people's standard of living. Again, sometimes it seems obvious, but because of the lack of development, I think, in the microsimulation world until PolicyEngine came along, some of these features are somewhat missing. So if you guys need any help with that, I'm more than happy to. But that is our use case for PolicyEngine. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you. I found this really interesting. I'm quite intrigued by the lamentable lack of productivity in the UK. It's often been cited. I won't ask you to unpack that, but many years ago, I was an intern at the Treasury, and it was the Treasury economists that basically looked at policy, would advise ministers. Where is that work being done now?
Is used by the Treasury. Now, I think they have a suite of models, so it's not just this one. But speaking from experience of using that model, I can tell you that it's not possible to really do that kind of analysis that quickly. And I suspect what really happens is that a minister wants to talk about a particular policy choice. The civil servant will have to go away, run that policy on the model, write up the report and send it back to them. I'm seeing lots of nodding in the room, so from people maybe having experience of this, that is again a very clunky mechanical process. That I think ruins the relationship between ministers who want to explore something and the civil servants who have the sort of capability of assessing it. What I think would be really interesting is if this model is used more widely, is that the relationship will be kind of a different way around, where the minister will go to the civil servant and say, I've just used PolicyEngine, and I've just seen that it costs this. What do you think? So I think that's a really interesting way in which you democratize analysis and take it away from people like me and give it to the hands of basically everybody.
Sure. Just to comment, in my day, I'll disclose, I was an intern in 1987. So large-scale macroeconomic models, just basically a set of linked differential equations, were all the rage. So the Treasury had a model, Bank of England had a model. No one talks about those models any longer. They sort of rather fell from favour. They didn't sort of live up to expectations. This strikes me as a much more practical and better approach, but interesting, definitely. I mean, you persuade the civil servants that this is the way forward.
Someone's got to.
Any other questions for Max? I would just add to that, the intersection between microsimulation models and dynamic macro models is still, I think, somewhat early. Maybe, Max, you have seen more in the UK. OBR does have a model that aims to do this. but it's kind of like they're almost two steps. So I think integrating these perspectives will be increasingly important in the future and something we're keen to invest in.
I will add, just because we, at my former workplace, developed those same macro models that are used by the Treasury, which are more popular than the 5-day macro simulation one, thank God. Oftentimes, those models will have to make pretty simplifying assumptions about people's standard of living just to be able to function. So they don't get the same level of policy detail inherently built within them. So then you come to the other end of the spectrum here, where you look at the specific micro policies and aggregate up to a nation. That's what PolicyEngine offers. There is such a prize on the other end of somebody who can link the two things together. There are ways in which you can do it, so you can simplify the sort of outputs of PolicyEngine down to something that's relevant to a macro model. But I think this stuff is really, really important, because oftentimes when you talk to economists about productivity, we'll start talking about business investment, we'll start talking about public investment as a sort of primary drivers of productivity. We don't talk about is the relationship between welfare conditionality that we just spoke about, pushing people into unproductive sectors, and not giving them the insurance to take risks and go to those more productive sectors. So sometimes policy choices that you have no idea have a productivity impact are there in the background, but because those models aren't optimized, you don't get that kind of insight. So this might seem like a sort of techie, tool-based discussion, but the policy impact on wide debates, I think, is sort of fundamental and is something that people often overlook. So again, subject to funding, one day I think there will be a world in which somebody bridges those two things together and things might change.
Wonderful. Thank you, Max. And our next speaker is Malcolm Torrey. So Malcolm has a ton of different affiliations, but I think the ones that we've been inspired by most are his role doing, I think, the most microsimulation work around universal basic income, but also other kind of basic income, guaranteed income kind of policies in the UK. So really pleased to introduce Malcolm Torrey to talk about a carbon dividend analysis he did with PolicyEngine.
Thank you for inviting me to present some of this research. History is for something like 40 years. I have researched the feasibility and desirability of unconditional incomes. I got into microsimulation in the days of Polymod, right back about over 20 years ago now at the University of Cambridge. My aim was then, and always has been, to make the debate about unconditional incomes as intelligent as possible. And I'm being very pleased that PolicyEngine has also contributed to making the debate about unconditional incomes intelligent. So, first of all, I'm going to introduce some, first of all, a definition. Basic income is an unconditional income for every individual. It's as simple as that. If it's not that, it's not a basic income. It's without means test or behavioural test. Different amounts are permissible for different ages, but that's the only conditionality possible, because that's a conditionality that you can't affect yourself. Microsimulation of a basic income funded by changes to tax and benefits is where much of my microsimulation work has been. Just the basics here, which you all know, so I won't spend any time on them. It's a computer program with the country's tax and benefits written into it. Family resources survey data is passed through it to generate a range of statistics. The program can be rewritten, and some of us have learned to rewrite the UK mod program. It's a lot of, it has a language all of its own. It's as complicated as some of the things here have been talked about and dismissed. It's a very powerful tool, and we've been very pleased to have access to Euromod initially, as it was called, and then sadly after Brexit, the UK mod section had to be extracted from it, and we're all pleased that it's still available, and long may it last. So you reprogram what you rewrite parts of the program, and what really matters when you do that is understanding the benefits and tax systems of this country. Fortunately, for 2 years, I worked for the DWP, as it is now. It was the DHSS back then in the 1980s. And I worked for 2 years on the public counter of a supplementary benefit office. I therefore had the best possible education in how the benefit system of this country works. I also worked for a short period in a tax office and learnt a lot. You need to know that because you need to know how any change you're going to make to the tax and benefit system in this country is going to affect all kinds of other bits. And I would always encourage people involved in this world to actually get some practical experience. There's no substitute. So you rewrite the program, a new set of statistics, you compare with that, and you understand the real world consequences of changes that you've made. This work is being done by the Centre for Microsimulation and Policy Analysis, and I must credit them with everything I know about microsimulation. There are 2 ways of doing this research, and I would like to emphasize this to all of you in this room. You can choose a basic income scheme, a basic income, this applies to any policy change, with specified levels to each age group, funding mechanism, and so on. And you then evaluate your scheme. And this is what PolicyEngine does, it's what UK Mod does, it's what all sorts of other models do. You can take a very different approach. That is, you first of all set your feasibility criteria. You then experiment with multiple illustrative basic income schemes until you find one that fulfills the criteria. In my view, that's the way to do this kind of research. It's unfortunate that it is incredibly time-consuming. And when each year, until 2022, I would seek for a feasible basic income scheme for the UK, and it would sometimes take days because you change parameters all over the place in order to get close to your feasibility criteria that you've already set and you're not going to change. So here's the A set of feasibility criteria. You will see that they're a bit complex, but they all have reasons. As few changes as possible are to be made to the current system. Revenue neutrality, absolutely essential in today's world. You have to avoid, now this one's important. The third one I'd like you to take note of, because I will come back to it. The avoidance of significant household net disposable income losses, particularly for low-income households, and particularly an aim of no more than 2% of low-income households experiencing household net disposable income losses of more than 5%. Now, it's so easy to make a change to the current tax and benefit system that will tip loads of low-income households into poverty, even though you don't intend to do it. It's the complexity of our current system that does that, not the policy change that you want to make. And you just need to be aware of that. I'll come back to it. The basic rate of income tax has to rise by no more than 2 percentage points and so on. That's a psychological issue. It's about political possibilities. You want every single inequality and poverty index to reduce, and substantial numbers of households have to be taken off means-tested benefits. So those are my feasibility criteria, and when I've each year tried to find a feasible unconditional income scheme for the UK, I have managed to satisfy them all, but it takes days. Here's the most recent feasible basic income scheme. I won't go through the details, but I will go through, this is the levels for different individuals. And it tells you the tax rates that you have to charge. The funding of this illustrative scheme, I reduced to £3,000 per annum, the personal allowance. Savings allowance is reduced to 0, national insurance contribution earnings threshold reduced, and national insurance contributions at 12% on all earned income. I and many others have never understood why national insurance contributions drop down a cliff from 12% to 2% as your income rises. If you ask me, that's an easy take for the government, which they've never bothered to take. The important thing is at the bottom, basic incomes have to be taken into account in the same way as other income in means-tested benefits calculations. Now, here is the important bit. You will see that that particular illustrative scheme, which I eventually discovered, and eventually discover each year, reduces below 2% the number of households in the lowest equivalised disposable income quintile experiencing losses of over 5% at the point of implementation. If you don't take account of that kind of condition, then your policy is not feasible. We cannot tip large numbers of low-income households into deeper poverty. There's no way to reduce below 2%. I've never managed to do it. I've managed to get just below it, but you can't get much lower because of the complexity of our tax and benefits system. You will always cause losses when you make a change. The important thing is to reduce them as far as possible. These are the various poverty indices. All of them are reduced by that illustrative scheme, both before and after housing costs. Similarly, with inequality indices, they are all reduced by that illustrative scheme. Here is the redistribution pattern. It's exactly what you want to see. And similarly with incomes after housing costs. Now, to turn to the next project, which, now your book that you've got about this day is wrong. I'm sorry. I did not do this research that I'm about to report on. Vahid did it, and I'm most grateful. So thank you, Vahid. Instead of funding a basic income out of existing tax and benefits, it could be funded by a carbon tax, and so it would then become what we would call a carbon dividend. A carbon tax needs a carbon dividend so that household disposable incomes don't decline on the implementation of the tax. A carbon tax will put costs up, you must therefore protect incomes, and an unconditional income is one way of doing that. If a basic income redistributes from rich to poor, then it needs a carbon tax. The reason for that is if you redistribute from rich to poor, because poorer households tend to spend on goods and services any additional income, and wealthier households do not, the level of carbon emissions in the country will rise if you redistribute from rich to poor. This is a sad and complicated fact, which is why if you have a basic income scheme that redistributes from rich to poor, we need a carbon tax, because you have to then reduce your carbon emissions. The research on those consumption changes were done at the LSE in the Grantham Institute. So reduced use of carbon-based fuels reduces tax benefit for basic income. What you have to recognise, if we use a carbon tax to fund any policy change, then your revenue, you hope, will go down, because that's the point of the tax, to try and reduce. And so this has to be a temporary measure. Important one, but temporary. So here's micro-simulation of a carbon tax, which PolicyEngine has done for me, and I'm most grateful. A £100 per tonne carbon tax could pay for an unconditional dividend or basic income of £18.60 per week, and a £200 per tonne for a larger one, £37.40. It's a pretty straight line, that one. Here's the redistribution pattern. It's exactly what you want to see in terms of average changes in relation to the different income deciles. And similarly for the £200 tonne per, you'll see how similar they are. And what it means is that between those two, you're likely to see very similar patterns. It's what you want to see. This is an important piece of work, which you'll see in a minute why I introduced the tax and benefits funded basic income to start with. If you look at this pattern here, you'll see at the bottom that 12% of low-income households lose money on the basis of this carbon tax. Even though the average is in the right direction, a large number of low-income households are losing a lot of money. They are losing more than 5% of their income. And the same is true of the £200 per tonne tax. This means that, sadly, this particular policy on its own is not politically feasible and should not be pursued as it is. The conclusion that I draw is this. The carbon tax and unconditional dividend scheme would redistribute, yes, but there are too many low-income households who would lose too much money. The basic income scheme I introduced earlier, funded from current taxes and benefits, would not do that. The answer might lie in a scheme that would pay an unconditional dividend funded by both a carbon tax and changes to the existing tax and benefits system. This is an important policy conclusion, and I hope that those who might one day consider a carbon tax and dividend might take notice of this important piece of research. And I'm most grateful to the PolicyEngine for making this happen. Here's the paper on which the earlier slides were based. Will you be distributing these slides to people? Great, that means you have a look. These are the papers that PolicyEngine has published, which contain the information related to the second set of slides. And so I would urge you to look at the data in those. Thank you to Nikhil and Max for assistance with research over a number of years. It's been a pleasure to be able to collaborate with you. And special thanks, as I've said, to Vahid for the recent research on the 2 levels of carbon tax and dividend. I'm most grateful. Here's some books you might be interested in. Feasibility of Citizens' Income, published 2016. Why we need, this is a basic introduction to the subject. Here's a multidisciplinary text on the subject. This is what we call the Bible of the subject. It's the Paul Grave International Handbook of Basic Income. There's material in here on microsimulation. The research agenda for basic income, it might be of interest to people here. In particular, it comes out, I'm told, as a paperback this month. So it's hardback for the last couple of years, but it's now coming out in paperback if you want to buy one of those, and you'll find all the books, chapters and working papers on basic income at that website. Thank you. Any questions? I'll see what I can do.
Any questions for Malcolm?
I guess what's the next step then? If you have all this microsimulation research and like you're able to do these kind of excellent policy comparisons with PolicyEngine, how does that then? How can you see that then going from academia to kind of influencing policy decisions? Because that's, I think, kind of the hardest step.
That is a difficult step, and it's not how it works. What it does is, if ever there is a political turn to this way of reducing poverty, reducing inequality, and doing all sorts of other things, an increase in unconditionality has some important effect. One of the books that's not on there that you'll find on my website is the most recent one. It's simply called Unconditional, towards unconditionality in social policy. In particular, it helps to remove the kind of cliffs that people fall off when they experience means testing. And we experience means testing, particularly in this country, in so many fields now, that these cliffs get added to each other, making it very difficult. And I mean, my day job over the last 40 years has been as a parish priest in South London. And my experience of these cliffs, it's just appalling for people. The means testing is a terrible idea. Unfortunately, politicians love it. And the press sometimes loves it. And it's just infuriating because it's awful. The more unconditionality that we can introduce into our social policy system, the better it will be for so many people. People's sense of security will rise, mental health will rise. That's been proved by experiments in Canada. But it's going to take quite a psychological leap amongst public, journalists, think tanks, and politicians to understand the benefits of unconditionality because it's counterintuitive. It doesn't look sensible to pay money to everyone and then tax them, rather than to simply try and means test them so you only pay money to the poor. The effect is the same, but the outcome is very different indeed, because simply giving a small basic income, like the scheme that I illustrated here, would provide, just to take that example, a family of 4, £240 of utterly secure income that would never, ever go away, providing the kind of security that nobody has at the moment. Of course, and then you'll be able to build on it. in a better way than we can when means-tested benefits are reduced as people's incomes rise. The current system is disincentivizing. I could go on, I better not, really, sorry. Move my books.
Thank you, Malcolm.
I didn't really answer your question, I suppose. How's it going to happen? It won't happen in the UK in a hurry. For perfectly practical reason, we simply don't have a database that could do it. Gordon Brown is said to have considered this in 2008, asking himself whether we could inject money into the economy by simply giving it to everybody, and he was told, you haven't got the database to do it. We haven't. My money is on India, because India has had a substantial genuine pilot project in a large number of communities of different kinds of a genuine basic income, paid over 2 years, and the results were outstanding. The increase in economic activity amongst low earners was significant, and the same happened in Namibia. A real pilot project of a genuine basic income that could have been afforded by across the entire country. That's the important thing about a pilot project. If you hear about pilot projects in the United States, it's not true. They don't happen because what they've been testing there is guaranteed incomes, proxy means tested that you can never roll out nationwide, whereas the Indian and Namibian projects were amazing. And you'll find them in the handbook, written out by the researchers involved. Indian states have quite a lot of fiscal autonomy, and it wouldn't surprise me if one of them at some point decided to try a basic income across the whole state. That's where my money is. Yeah.
Thank you, Malcolm. We'll have to figure out how to get that timeline shortened, maybe with PolicyEngine, so it's not so many days of your time to find the optimal policy. And one thing Anthony did not show, but is in both V1 and V2 of the app, you can see the marginal tax rate schedule of individual households. So if you're interested in seeing how means testing kind of contributes to overall marginal tax rates, it often is surprising, I think, to policymakers.
In the microsimulation work that I showed you, if you look at the original papers on the website, from which the first set of slides were extracted, then you can find that kind of information. It's all there. Yeah.
Yes. Although I have to say it's much more surprising in the US than in the UK. The shapes get a little out there. So thank you again, Malcolm. Our next presenter is our own Vahid Ahmadi, who's going to talk about how we're going beyond household data into synthesizing firms to estimate our understanding of VAT.
Okay, thank you, Max. Yeah, for this section, I want to present a kind of having a next step, going further behind the microsimulation only for household. So I want to present you a method that we can use microsimulation modeling for the firm level analysis. So the VAT is actually, from the business perspective, from the firm level, is actually if your annual turnover exceeded from a certain amount, you need to pay taxes. And there is actively an active policy debate about changing the VAT registration threshold and also the rate of the VAT. So by the method that I'll explain, we are able to have a kind of analysis on, for example, if you want to change the VAT registration threshold or having a smooth phase-in tax function, what happened to the economy in terms of budgetary impact, distributional impact on the firm side, and what happened to, for example, the heterogeneous effect on the different industries. So the starting point here is we have the ONS, UK Business Statistics, and also HMRC VAT statistics for VAT registered business profiles. But we don't have the micro data on that. So we only have the data on, for example, here, I show you the distribution of the firms in the UK based on the turnover band from the ONS and also HMRC. So as you can see here, the turnover band are much big here. So if you want to have a kind of micro-founded analysis, we can use the micro-simulation modeling, like what we did for the household side, and try to replicate those methodology for the firm-level analysis. So based on these data that we have, the official statistics from the ONS and HMRC, we actually have the information about the turnover, tax liability, industry and sector, and employment size. So what I'm going to do is that, starting from one of them, try to generate synthetic data. And then, just like the household perspective, trying to calibrate based on the official statistics that we have. As an example, number of the firms in each industry and in each turnover band. So as you can see here, we have a nice distribution of the UK firms by annual turnover. You can see there is a kind of bunching behavior around the 90K, and also for the VAT flat rate scheme. Yeah, we can see the sharp decrease here. Okay, we build a model. We build a data set right now, synthetic data. Let's compare our result with HMRC revenue projections. So we benchmark our results against HMRC published projection from raising the VAT threshold from 85K to 90K. We also apply the OBR retail price index growth to the firm turnover and VAT liabilities. But just for simplicity here, we just hold the firm counts constant, and there is no behavioral responses here. I will explain the behavior response in the next section. As you can see here, for most of the, for all of the years, we are good at projections here. So there is a dashboard for VAT policy simulations. We built that, and you can, for example, on the left-hand side, you can change the VAT threshold, or you can also have a tapper here. For example, VAT zero rate at 70K, and then increasing to 20% to, for example, for 100K. So this dashboard is for static analysis, but the next step is that, okay, if we change something, for example, VAT threshold, firms respond to the tax incentives here. So we want to expand the micro simulation that we have to capture the behavior responses. We just started from a simple equation and see the problem from the firm's perspective. So each firm is trying to maximize the profit by choosing a turnover here. So tau is a function of tax here, y is output, c is cost, and you can see that, the tax function is actually applied from government side. So by choosing the VAT, by choosing the yi, we actually are choosing the tax that we are paying. So we want to find the optimal decision for each household, for each firm. Then the problem would be kind of the firms choosing the output where the marginal revenue net of VAT is equal to marginal cost, just FOC simply. But we need some assumptions here, because in the maximization problem, the equation, we have a kind of cost based on the output, based on the turnover. So just simply again, we considering Cobb-Douglas production function. The AI is a technology part, is a productivity part, and we with actually applying this kind of production function, we can capture the heterogeneity among the firms. If you are more productive, you can make more, you can produce more from an equal level of the input. For now, the VAT is a kind of a step function. So if you are exceeding from the 90K, your government applied 20% VAT tax rate for you. But here, because we need to differentiate that equation, we just consider a smooth sigmoid tax schedule here. And you can see that the parameter K and T star here is kind of hyperparameter. And based on the distribution that you have from the real world, you can just tune these kind of parameters. And this is how we are calibrate our data, our distribution, based on the real world. And then this allows us to actually implement new policies to see the changes. One extension here, the firm couldn't actually predict the optimal output for example, for the next year. So just simply here, we consider the Y uncertainty, the future Y, is a term times Y optimal. And I call it the uncertainty parameter here, 1 plus epsilon I. The epsilon I is actually the uncertainty part, and it's driven by a normal distribution. But if you are close to you are near to the threshold, you actually don't want to fall behind the threshold. So you want to escape for that situation. So in that sense, I just apply the kind of skewed normal function for that, for the epsilon I, if you are within a window of that threshold. Otherwise, it's a just simple normal function. So mu and sigma here, again, are hyperparameters, and you can tune that based on the real world. Yeah, we follow the bunching literature here for the no-notch scenario. So no-notch scenario is basically says there is no step function here. So gradually we increase the tax, VAT tax for the firms. And based on that, we actually can have another distribution. And if we replicate the no-notch scenario, like the bunching literature, and by having the real world and a counterfactual, we actually can estimate the elasticities and see how firms in each turnover band and in each sector will respond to tax changes. So last slide. The blue dots here are showing the observed distribution, and the y-axis is number of firms, x-axis is turnover, this stands from 90K, the current policy. The red one is the no-notch scenario that I explained. We just skip the window, for example, 20K around the current threshold. We just skip those parts, and then trying to fit a polynomial curve to that, and we call it no-notch scenario. Yeah, and then by having these two distributions, we can just simply estimate the elasticities and also estimate the heterogeneity among the elasticities. One last thing is that, yeah, what if we just having a kind of new policy, for example, changing the VAT threshold from 90K to 100K. So we know how to apply the hyperparameter. We learned about that based on the current distribution that we have, and then just simply we can change the tax function and then trying to replicate the new distributions. But the thing is that here is the micro-founded level analysis. So we have the mapping one-to-one from the current distribution to the next distribution. Yeah, I think that's it if you have any question.
Thank you. That's a fascinating presentation.
Thank you.
Just a follow-up question, kind of thinking about the firms and how you model them. Are you thinking separately about the intensive margin and the extensive margin? And I will explain why I'm asking about that. Because just thinking about the entry and exit, from the markups, for example, literature, we know that the markups seem to be increasing, right? There is a kind of a concentration of market power in some industries. And I was just wondering how that might relate to your results, whether you think about business dynamism, whether you think, for example, about the effect of the VAT threshold or the rate changes on firm entry, exit, how that might relate to the assumption that the marginal price is equal to marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, which kind of assumes perfectly competitive markets, right?
Yeah.
If you had any comments on that, thank you.
Yeah. In the current setting, we just, as I explained, we just considering that the firms are actually predicting the future output. In that sense, we are modeling all of this behavior with one elasticity. The problem for the firms is not just being below or above the threshold. They are just choosing the Y for the next year, okay? In that sense, the elasticity that we can estimate from the differences between these two distributions is basically the differences in the turnover over the differences in the tax paid. So in that sense, we are just capturing all of the intensive and extensive into one elasticity. But if we can model it to have a kind of binary decision to just being above or below the threshold. And in that sense, again, we can apply the intensive margin. But for now, we are just capturing with one elasticity. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. We have one question here.
Thank you. I've got a basic question and two supplementary questions. So the basic one is, what about altering the level of VAT? Have you considered those type of changes? Because remember, 20% is not fixed. Government can choose to alter that level. And then I wanted to pick you up on your Cobb-Douglas production function and also your generalized sigmoid. I wasn't quite sure exactly what you were modeling here.
One of the parameters here is tau max, not tau max, but here you can actually apply different tau and then see the results. So it's not only about changing the threshold. You can just apply different tau max here and get the result. This is from the first question. Sorry, what was your second?
Well, it was about changing the level of VAT. So maybe I make
this is the level of VAT. Yeah,
18%. So tau is the level of VAT.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
tau
so
max
that's
is
point. Okay, that's fine.
And the sigmoid is just basically you can just replicate the SF function with the simple sigmoid. The point is that because we need to differentiate that equation for the first one for the firm's decision. We actually escape from having a discrete choice here. Then we can actually have a kind of rough estimation about how we can apply with the sigmoid continuous format.
But and I love the sigmoid.
Yeah.
It's got me out of jail on many an occasion. But what exactly are you modeling here? You modeling the tax take?
No, the maximization is based on the output. So firms are deciding about the output, the turnover for example, next year. Yeah. This is what we're modeling.
Okay, I'd like to see some pictures. It might make it easier for me. Sorry, I'm not,
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, we can discuss
quite with you. Thanks.
Thank you.
And should also note, we have the URL we'll send around the current static simulator tool that we've built. The dynamic side, we're still collecting feedback. So this is a sort of open conversation. We haven't done the work yet, except for sort of laying out how we're thinking about potentially the economics behind it. So definitely would appreciate feedback in the break or by email or anything like that.
Yeah, Max, this is the dashboard, the static dashboard. So, you can apply, for example, different threshold rates.
And we could, I think, easily adjust the rate as
Yeah,
well.
yeah,
here,
yeah, yeah.
On the SAG side. Okay, thank you, Fahid.
Yeah, sure.
We're going to make a slight adjustment to the schedule. So we are actually going to move into the panel discussion now. So I'd love to welcome our two panelists here. Oops. So first, you've heard from before, Anvar Sarikulov, who is from a senior grants and program manager at the Nuffield Foundation. Should note that basically most of what you're seeing today is supported by the Nuffield Foundation in terms of the local area modeling, the new version of the app, the public services, and the childcare. But Anvar has also seen up close and personal sort of how the new strategic direction from Nuffield is being deployed and how that came to be. So excited to hear from him. And then we have also Aaron Advani, who is director of the Center for Analysis of Taxation, or CENTAX, and professor of economics at Warwick, also a research fellow at IFS, and advisory panel member at OBR, who has been really instrumental in connecting academic research in economics to the policymaking process. I'm a little far. I'm going to reorganize this slightly. So thank you both for being here. And I'll start with some questions and definitely welcome questions from the room as well. I want to start just by asking if you could talk about what evidence-based policymaking means to you and your organization and how you're thinking about it in the current day challenges. Maybe Anvar, if you want to start.
Yes, of course. I think our tagline is the power of evidence to change lives. So we place very high value on the role that evidence can take in informing decisions and policy making. And I just had a few more reflections on this, but at quite a top level, we spent a lot of time today thinking about the particularities of modeling and the specifics of various approaches. And I just wanted to reflect on some of the challenges that policymaking, and particularly evidence-based policymaking, has in the current environment and ecosystems. I think we are always, as a foundation, interested in kind of the longer term and thinking about how technology, demography, and other kind of aspects of kind of longer term trends are impacting and affecting our kind of everyday life now. And I think I just wanted to kind of reflect on that. I think, first of all, to note, I think we're seeing very significant fragmentation in kind of the various key ecosystems, particularly both political and media ones. I mean, it's predicting politics is a fool's errand, but we are now looking to being a multi-party system where we have quite complex contestation, and we have many of those parties are very underdeveloped ecosystems for information and research and policy development. And I think it's important for us to consider how we can enable higher quality research and put good tools into the hands of the greater diversity of political and policy agents that are now out there in the country. And I think there's also an important geographic component here, because we're seeing the fragmenting of the party system has already happened in Scotland to a significant degree, and it seems like the same is already happening in Wales too, and we're investing into analysis there too. So I think that's also an important geographic component to consider, and that's why it's so great that PolicyEngine is putting a lot of focus on kind of local level estimates. I also think the fact that the fragmentation is happening in the media landscape has another important dimension, in that we need to have ability to provide evidence and evaluation in wider range of formats. I mean, fundamentally, people are accessing news and analysis in very different formats, and this will probably accelerate with AI agents, as we've seen. So I think, again, kind of the kind of potential for policy and tools like PolicyEngine to make it easier for various kind of agents with smaller audiences to do analysis is important. So I think that's kind of my main kind of reflections on that.
Shall I grab that? Thanks. So Syntax, the organization that I direct, is a research-based organization at a university, but with a strong focus on trying to make policy change happen, so trying to inform people about the effects of possible changes and providing all of the evidence base that's needed for those specific kinds of changes, so that ultimately the decisions should be made by politicians and policymakers, but they should be made in the most informed possible way. And so for us, that need for evidence base is the bit that we think of ourselves as providing. We do is to use quantitative data from the tax authority, all anonymized, and with access to that microdata, we can look at what the effects of a reform are going to be by looking at first distributional consequences. That's kind of the classic microsim thing that you can do, is not just get revenue, but get those distributions out, but then also think about using previous reforms, trying to understand what's the most likely types of behavioral response, what the consequences of those are going to be, and trying to sort of build from there into a wider understanding. We've done a lot of work with politicians of different parties talking about tax reform and trying to understand what kinds of reforms might be needed and kind of what the process looks like. I think it's really interesting talking to politicians about these things because the kinds of areas they pick up on, the kind of questions they have, are not always the ones that we might first think of. So I won't mention names, but a senior MP a few years ago who was in government, and we were talking about capital gains tax reform, and an area that they asked about, which we hadn't done any work on, we hadn't seen any evidence on, but we're in the context of thinking about a sort of Merleesian idealized tax reform, so a capital gains tax that takes the normal rate of return sort of out of the tax base, so we're not taxing just the cost of borrowing, and then otherwise taxes everything else the same rate as income. Like that's a fairly standard kind of proposition for a lot of people who work in the tax space, that's what an idealized capital gains would look like. And this person said to me, look, I understand everything you're saying about this kind of design, but I just haven't seen any evidence on what would this do to those small number of people, they may be small, but they're small number of people who are actually really big reinvestors. They make a load of money, and it matters to them what the rate is at the end of selling an asset, because having a low rate when they sell the asset is what gives them the capital they need to go and do the next bit of investment. Well, that's really interesting. It's not in the standard model, it's not a thing we kind of typically think about, but actually, if there were a small number of people who were really effective at that, then even if we agree that in a lot of cases that's not what's happening, that could be really important. And that's the kind of way into a sort of two-way dialogue with policymakers about the evidence base. This politician wasn't saying that they strongly felt that was the case. I mean, he had an intuition that this was the situation, but he was open to being persuaded based on what the evidence said. He just hadn't seen any, and we hadn't either. And so I think that's where actually researchers and people who are in that sort of space come into our own, because we're, in that sense, trusted to go out there and do the number crunching, do the development of the evidence base by trying to use the best methods we can to work out how could we answer this question in a way that would help us at least have a common ground of the things we're thinking. I agree with what Anvar says, that finding a common ground of sort of fact of just what the situation is getting in some ways harder in a more fragmented landscape. But that's even more reason for there being some trusted sources like PolicyEngine that you can go to, you can understand how it's done. It's all open source, so if you care to interrogate it, you can interrogate it and understand how they get there, and there's nothing sort of nefarious in there that's biasing it in one way or another. And then you can use that base to try to make recommendations or discuss the merits or demerits of particular policy options.
So it sounds like there's both the fragmentation of there's like a demand problem and kind of a supply challenge that you both described of fragmentation in the market for ideas, and also new kind of ideas, new ideas of how people might respond to policies. I'm curious if you can comment on how is the evidence base evolving? Where are the tools or data sets that are sort of enabling us to answer these questions in new ways to meet those demands and supply?
I'll grab it first since I've got the mic already. I guess in the UK, people who are doing UK quant research will know that a lot of the data that's coming out of the Office for National Statistics, which is our sort of national statistics provider, is being heavily criticized. Unlike the US, where the criticism isn't obviously well-founded, in this case, I think there's some fairly well-founded criticisms that the data that have been being produced have some fairly fundamental flaws. And that is making it harder to do kind of accurate research, because however good your method is and however good your idea is, if the underlying numbers are sort of getting towards junk, it's hard to make sense of that and decide how to treat it. I guess the good news story is that administrative data are becoming more available. They're still harder to access than they should be. It's still never a priority for anyone who's in government, when they're in government, to make them more available. When you're not in government, you don't have a civil service to help you, and so researchers externally are very valuable to you, and their access to data to be able to provide you information is really useful. Once you're in government, it's not that you necessarily think it's a bad thing, it's just it's not important for you to try and make that more available because it's not helping you, and there's lots of other fires to fight. But making administrative data available has been sort of the direction of travel in the UK for the last 10, 15 years. And as those data become more available, they have all the limitations that come from administrative data. They don't contain lots of things that we'd love to know about. They are not going to capture certain things that aren't relevant to the administrative system. But they have the advantages that you suddenly have population-wide data kind of comprehensively across things, rather than these surveys where we're always arguing about whether the weights are really correct. And so that's I guess, the really big positive. And as those data become more available and more of those things can kind of shipped into things like tools like PolicyEngine, the better the quality of evidence will be that we all have.
Yeah, I want to rehearse all the arguments about the decline of survey data and kind of the increasing usage of administrative data. I imagine most people in the room are quite familiar with them. But I think the other bit of kind of increasingly top source that we are seeing and encouraging in the kind of work we fund is thinking about what kind of the new computational capabilities can allow you to do with the troves of data that is lying around in various organizations or in other contexts. We have a very interesting research that uses citizens' advice caseworker data, completely unstructured, to basically crunches it through a massive LLM. It's about 10 terabytes of data, and then kind of analyzes the pathways to food bank referrals, basically. And that's only possible through this large computational models. We have another one that's going to be announced soon that's using planning data from local housing authorities that are 100 terabytes of data. So I think that's another potential promising direction of research, given what the problems that are increasingly emerging from survey-based data collection.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty big data. Yeah, and I mean, we're starting to think about how we can use LLMs for also even simulating behavioral responses and elasticities. There's some really interesting research around can you simulate agents, human agents with social science. I'm curious, Aaron, if you've sort of looked into that, or like, any other ways you guys are using LLMs potentially, or?
So we actually aren't using many of those types of tools, not because they aren't great tools to use, but because the trade-off that we have is the data we're using are accessible in a secure room on a fairly old school computer, or a set of old school computers, and no access to the internet or any of the nice tools that are out there. And I don't think we would be trusted to build our own internal LLM, although we have thought internally about whether that would be the kind of thing we'd be allowed to do, but I don't think we'd be trusted to do that. And so in the absence of being able to do something like that, we don't have a setup that lets us use that for pretty much any of the research work that we're doing, although I think there's a lot of kind of capability that is coming from there. I mean, I think in the UK, sort of for the research community, the soonest place that would happen would be when something like the Secure Research Service that the ONS runs, which is where you can access a lot of administrative data, when that allows those sorts of tools to be accessible inside, which I don't know if and when that will happen, but that feels like a lower bar to achieve than trying to get it into the secure lab that we use at HMRC. But if it were available through those sorts of things, that would clearly enable lots of things, both in terms of things that even the best programs don't have the time and capacity to do in any other way, but also allow researchers whose skills are not going to be being top coders, but actually the vibe coding kind of approach will do enough for them, and that plus some extra capacity and support will be enough for them to actually be able to get at some really cool questions. Because actually the other thing that is always interesting, I mean, at Syntax, I'm an economist by background, but we are actually kind of multidisciplinary, and we have a lawyer who co-leads the team with me, but we've had sociologists in the team, we have data science folk, we've got all kinds of people around. And when we've worked with qual people, it's always interesting because they come up with different kinds of questions sometimes to the ones that we have. And so when if they were able to sort of go wild with the data and know how to just talk to the AI and get the AI to actually do the coding, they'd come up with all kinds of cool questions, and it'd be great to see the answers for those things, and in a set of areas where they have the contextual knowledge that leads them to certain questions, but they don't have, they have lots of other skills, and therefore they didn't build up capacity and the kind of quant skills they need for data.
Yeah, it could be an opportunity for maybe open weights models in the future. That'd be very exciting. Shifting gears, would love to hear your perspectives on, so we've got this amazing research that's being done with increasingly high fidelity big data, using even more advanced econometric techniques than we've had in the past. How do you turn that into evidence-based policymaking?
I'd say that the thing that I love about PolicyEngine, this is not, we weren't primed to say this, but actually I think PolicyEngine is a great example of this, is to do evidence-based policy, you sort of need two things, right? You need the evidence bit, the underlying science that actually is correct, you get the numbers right, because without that, we're all lost. But then you also need to be really good at comms. You need to really make it a user interface that's really accessible, that people can understand, or if, in our case, we don't do it through user interface, we write our reports, but we write them in a style that is, basically a picture and a couple of paragraphs and another picture and a heading. And so it's all very, very straightforward to follow and doesn't require any background or specialist skills. And I think that finding whatever it is that's your route into being able to communicate clearly is a crucial part of it, because there are too many people who have brilliant skills in doing the underlying research and have got brilliant ideas, but then don't manage to get them out there in a way that is sort of understood, that where people can grab the hook and understand why should I care. And without that, it's just not going to be useful for that bit, and then you need to find someone who can instead translate it. So as long as that translation's happening, whether being done yourselves as a researcher or finding a partner who can do that. But what I love is that, as you had demonstrated earlier, this is a tool that doesn't require you to understand all the details. If you do, that's great, because you can go in and mess with it and adjust it how you want to. But if you don't, you can go in and just say, actually, I want to point and click my way through this, and at the end of it, I'm going to get answers to important questions. I think that really makes it very powerful and means that, just over the road in Parliament, every advisor to an MP, every sort of junior researcher can sit there and use this as the way of testing their MP's favourite idea for a tax reform and going like, here's what you're actually going to get. And that's really good. That's really helpful that they can have that kind of common ground for a discussion about it.
Before, I'd love to hear Anvar's view, but can I just ask you one follow-up, Aaron? There's a comms angle, and there's also, I think, like an external validity question. You never have the same policy that's being introduced as what you've evaluated in the past. So you have to boil it down to elasticities or parameters that are generalizable. And the way you construct that can sometimes have a significant effect on how you will eventually come to your policy conclusion for newly proposed reforms or options. How you strike that balance?
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. I sort of said, there's the quant bit and there's the comms bit. The quant bit is obviously difficult, and there is a lot of uncertainty in what those behavioral responses are, because as you say, any specific environment, any specific context that you had to estimate that effect, it won't necessarily be the same again. I think the best you can do is to try to understand, firstly, how, don't just get your elasticity from one single reform. I mean, you'll probably try and get one in a related context, but look at the evidence in other countries, in other contexts, and trying to work out, what's the sort of space of what that elasticity looks like. Where does that parameter move around? We don't expect it to be the same number in any different place, but can you understand what it looks like? Can you understand the reasons why it's different? We had I'm an academic, so at some point I have to mention a paper of my own. It's a requirement, job requirement. So we had a paper a few years ago looking at wealth taxes and looking at just getting the best estimate of what a behavioral elasticity to a wealth tax looks like. And there's obviously no one answer to that, because design matters, right? How you design the wealth tax really matters. And so when you look at what's the best elasticity estimate you can get for Switzerland compared to Spain, compared to France when it had one, compared to Norway, you get very different numbers. But actually one thing you can do is to try to say, well, okay, we know there are differences in actually how those policies were designed, and maybe we can find other evidence on what we think the effect of, for example, leaving one particular asset class out is. And you can use that to benchmark, okay, so if you weren't to make that policy design, can that bring us closer? So actually, the paper that we have, you should all go and read it, but the paper we have starts with the fact that the kind of space of well-published elasticities for wealth tax vary by a factor of 800. And that is a crazy number for an elasticity to vary, like for the range to be multiple 800. And we basically say, look, you can actually just boil all of that down to context. I mean, the range that we get is for a number that's, basically 100%, right? So it's between 7 and 17 is the number, 0.7. And 17 is sort of what you should think of the number as being. And that's, you can explain why there's uncertainty around that space. And obviously, all of the external validity questions then still come in of just, each country is a bit different. People could behave a bit differently. But a lot of those big differences that you're seeing, rather than being a factor of 2 out, that factor of 800 is coming from the fact that there's all these contextual things. And you want to try and strip those out. So those are things that we can, again, do to try to explain, okay, if you were talking to a MP or something who was interested, you can say, look, there are these ranges of what we've seen in other countries. Here are some of the reasons why they're different. Here is how you could get to a sense for what it looks like here. At some point, there's a range that we have to just accept. We can't be sure about, is it this number or this number? And it's a sort of fool's errand to try to predict more than that, because anyway, enough of the other macroeconomic factors, by the time any reform came in, you just wouldn't be able to be sure what you get, because incomes will be different. The level of capital gains will be different. Whatever tax they're thinking about, it just will be different in terms of what the tax base looks like by then anyway.
Anvar, yeah, so I guess from research to policy, it seems like there's a comms angle, there's external validity, which could mean context, it can mean uncertainty, it can mean, even how you construct the parameters in the model. Like, how does Nuffield think about tackling all those kinds of roadblocks?
Yeah, well, I think our guide for applicants has like a complex 5-point framework, which I will definitely not be able to recite. But I just want to point on 2 things which I think we often focus on with a lot of our grant holders. First, as I think kind of accessible outputs, I'm just going to reiterate because it's so important. I mean, we have all this like increasingly complicated methods for analysis, but the matter of fact is that most of your consumers of that research do not want to know how the sausage is made. They just want to know that you've put the right bits into it. You don't need to explain in detail in many of your outputs what exactly you are doing. There needs to be a way for you to show that for an audience that cares about it, but a lot of the audience in the policy making what doesn't. And I think the second thing I wanted to make, and it's still kind of coming back to comms, but I think it's one thing that a lot of people don't think about in the research space, is about the complex, sometimes quite complex information ecosystems in which different kind of factions of politicians and policymakers inhabit, and again, kind of come back to the point of fragmentation, how to effectively target the kind of different factions, kind of different third sector bodies, kind of different other interest groups, and how all of this interacts together. And it's actually quite hard work to do this well, but it's something that I think is really important if you really are aiming for impact, especially in contested policy space.
And yeah, thinking also about the contested policy space, the value of openness and transparency, where you think that fits in.
I mean, obviously, it's really important in that you are. There will always be in contested policy space. There will always be factions and individuals who hold strong views who are going to contest what you say, no matter kind of how open and transparent you are. So you're not trying to kind of convince everybody, but there are kind of audiences central to the process, which are open to kind of persuasion and argument, and those are the kind of, and that's where the kind of the openness and transparency becomes really important.
Can I just pick up on that? I mean, I think that's a really important point. I mean, one thing I sort of touched on already was how great it is with PolicyEngine that you can go in and just change a parameter if you want to. If you don't believe the elasticity that these guys have put in there, you can go and change it and make it what you want. It's like we do in our reports is to make sure that, we'll say here's our kind of preferred estimate, but we're clear there's uncertainty. We'll give a range of what we think is sort of plausible. We'll then have a table of like, pick your favorite elasticity from this long list, some of which we think are totally implausible, and you can have the number you want because, we'll tell you what we think, but we also want to leave that space open for people for reasonable people to disagree and for people to say, okay, if I have a very different belief to you about a particular thing which you can't strongly evidence in a way that you can convince me, then how different would my result be? I just want to add one other thing, which I think this is an area actually where I think government does really terribly. I don't know if any of you have the pain of having to read any of the things that come out of the tax authority after a budget, but they put out sort of their evidence base for what happened and why they think this is the number they're going to get to. And it's basically impossible to figure out what happened. Okay, actually after the last budget, the budget last year, the Office for Budget Responsibility last January, or this January 2025, published these sort of supplementary notices, which at least did put slightly more information into the public domain of actually what elasticity is being used, how have we got here, like what are any of the steps you would need to know to understand how this is done. Because I agree with Anwar, like 99.9% of people out there do not care how this sausage was made, but there are a few of us who really do, and sometimes might not agree or might not understand it. And it's deeply frustrating when you look at these things and you can't even work out how they got to what they got to, and you can't work out why you disagree. So I think it's really important for us to be effective and to be kind of sensible players in the ecosystem of information, that it's possible for people to disagree with you and to understand, well, if this is what they disagree with you about, how different should the answer be? There'll be people out there who clearly just disagree because they disagree. They have a very strong view in whichever direction it is, and then they're not going to be persuaded. But at least you want to make it clear, if they think you got one point wrong, like how would changing that point affect the answers that you reach?
Yeah, and that gets into, you're describing sensitivity analysis, which is definitely a feature. Yeah, I invite you all to try different elasticities in our software, and it's great when other reports sort of include it. Earlier today, we were talking about sort of the absence of true uncertainty modeling. So I'll ask you kind of a wonkier follow-up. Basically no one in the microsimulation space tries to say, here's the actual 90% confidence interval for either this parameter or this impact of a policy reform, and therefore it makes it really hard to do the back testing, because it's like, okay, was I off or not? If you're just giving a point estimate and that's the end of the story. How we move toward a better epistemic framework for all this?
Yeah, nice easy question for a Monday afternoon. Deep uncertainty is a really hard one to cover, right? Because, at the most fundamental level, even if we knew everything about the past and could know precisely what this parameter was yesterday, as I said earlier, I have literally no idea what the tax base is going to be next year. Let's imagine we're talking about capital gains tax reform. So many things will affect what the stock of capital gains are to be realized by next year. If there's a financial crisis, suddenly stock prices go down. None of us, unless you have made lots of money, in which case you're probably not here, but otherwise none of us probably predicted quite how much tech stocks would have grown in the last couple of years in the US. Because if you had, you could have made quite a lot of cash out of that. So there's a lot of things you just can't possibly foresee. And again, I think that's where the transparency helps, because you can say, look, these are the bits, I can be clear which of the bits I feel strongly about. I feel strongly that if you make this kind of reform, these are the kinds of behaviors people can do, and this is the kind of range that I can think of as a plausible elasticity. Like, I've never seen any credible number outside of this range, so I think you should look in this space. And I can be relatively sure that the tax base last year was this. So this is, at least, if you imagine this reform had happened last year, here's my best estimate of the counterfactual for the previous year. And then there's kind of all bets are off on some things, and what the world looks like tomorrow is going to be very uncertain. If we're talking about income tax, I have a sense for, well, it's unlikely that collectively incomes in the country fall by more than a certain amount or rise by more than a certain amount. So I could give you some sense of how uncertain I feel about that. There's still some things out there. I wouldn't have predicted COVID. So if you'd asked me in 2019 what would have happened, I would definitely have been wrong on basically every possible reform, including the easy ones, like what happens if you put a penny on income tax. I would have got that wrong. But then there's there are harder tax bases where things change more rapidly, and so if the tax base itself is more volatile anyway or more responsive to external factors, those kinds of things make it really, really hard. I don't think there is a great answer to what that framework looks like, other than, it is essentially a kind of approximated sensitivity analysis for just what do I think is the space of plausible outcomes for next year, and sort of scenario modeling rather than sensitivity. But yeah, as I say, in 2019, I certainly would have got it all very wrong because I would not have seen COVID coming. And so I don't think any model, if you asked me, give me a range of possible things that could happen, none of them would have included, well, the world shuts down for 6 months.
I just had a much more practical point about this when thinking about political polling, which I have a bit of background in, and where obviously there's fundamental uncertainty in any kind of political polling exercise. But getting things wrong on the thresholds is very, very damaging, even if, from a modeling perspective, that's completely within kind of reason. People are going to be upset with you and think you're on a problem. So from just a practical point, I think it's worth just sometimes reflecting on, is there a threshold within the confidence intervals that would be an issue or not? But that doesn't address a fundamental epistemic challenge, just more of a kind of expectation management.
Anvar, want to shift gears and sort of ask you if you're okay with sort of an inside view onto this new strategic framework from Nuffield. I'll save you the test of trying to recite from memory. So I'll just sort of list my understanding of the 5 priority questions that are new. So one is around prosperity and fairness. How can we build a prosperous and fair society where people are secure and can fulfill their potential? Second question, how can we build an inclusive society in the context of changing demography and ways of life? Third, how can we ensure rapid developments in science and technology work for people and society? Fourth, how can policies to address climate change be developed in a way that promotes a prosperous, fair, and inclusive society? And finally, how can we build and maintain effective, accountable, and trustworthy institutions? Now, you work in the welfare division of Nuffield. I'm curious, how did the framework change, sort of manifest, come to be? What were those conversations like, and how is it affecting investments you're thinking about now?
As you can see, there's a lot that we're interested in, but I want to emphasize, I think, a few kind of two particular gear changes for us. One is a much bigger emphasis on what is described as prosperity, but really it means about growth and productivity. I think we've funded some quite big work in this through the Resolution Foundation's Economy 2030 grant over the last 5 years, but I think we really do want to grapple more with the fundamental question about how we can achieve higher growth and how that growth can then result in better living standards, because I think that is kind of foundational for that. And if you have any brilliant ideas about how we can do so, please come and talk to me. And what research will help you enable that. I think the second, and I alluded to this in my initial comment, is about the role of demography and how the shifting demography of the UK is going to fundamentally affect both economic things like growth, but also kind of other kind of public finances and other kind of dimensions of economic and social well-being. Economists have been talking for a long time about the long-term implications of demography, but I don't think there's been quite enough work kind of trying to figure out like what does that actually mean, and are there any remedies to those kind of demographic challenges that we're facing?
Are you working on demographics and demography, Aaron? Okay.
No, on growth.
Yeah.
We are working on the intersection between tax and growth, so we should have a coffee.
Well, I'll open it up in a minute. Just one final question from me, which is thinking to the future. There's, if you believe sort of the bull market in AI stocks and everything else, there's going to be a radical transformation potentially already occurring, maybe more so in the future from a societal level. That's also a new set of tools that can be deployed for novel research, and policies will have to grapple with all these changes. But either within AI or more broadly, like what makes you excited or anxious for the coming years in your work?
From a direct work perspective, I think AI is clearly a positive, as in it just expands our capacity to do things, and there's lots of things I can do faster with having an AI agent. Even just in terms of my life admin of trying to reply to all the emails and things, it's great as a tool for those sorts of purposes. So definitely in that sense, it's a positive. On the tax side, a sort of interesting challenge that we're thinking about is the implications of the balance between both labor and capital, in terms of if more of the return from work is based on working with AI as a kind of co-partner in your production process, then there will be some return at some point to that capital. And then also from a UK perspective, that capital is not mostly UK based. And so what does that mean for tax in the UK in a world in which some of the production process is now something that we basically can't tax because it's not a UK based entity unless we sort of change the way the tax system is working. So I think there's some interesting challenges there just conceptually that we have started to think about but don't have any big conclusions on just yet.
Just to flag, we do a lot of work on AI as foundation for the Ada Lovelace Institute, who will have lots of opinions and outputs on this, but just in a very kind of narrow kind of economic dimension, I think we're really good to see more robust research on what even the current generation of AI tools is doing or not doing to various kind of economic indicators. I think some of the very preliminary research on employment effects of early graduates in the US is not particularly showing the effects people were expecting, but this is, of course, very early days. But I think that's kind of where I would be interested to see more.
All right, thank you, Anvar and Aaron. Any questions from the room? No? Okay, well, oh, great. Okay, thank you. Oh, yeah.
Thank you. So just thinking about kind of data developments and what would be most helpful for research, I was wondering if you might share your thoughts on what you think would be most beneficial to the research that you do from that perspective. I mean, we obviously mentioned the admin data, but I think there is still value in survey data. So just, yeah, would be curious to hear your thoughts. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a good question. I've got a very, very long list of data improvements I like, so it's hard to sort of know where to start. I guess if I take one on admin and one on survey as two examples, I guess on the survey side, you know, as I said earlier, and as you all know, there are some things that we just don't have in the admin data. So one survey that in the UK used to really be world leading and be very good quality that I made good use of was the Wealth and Asset Survey. It's basically the only way to measure wealth in the UK. I mean, there are some other surveys that have for subpopulations of the UK, so for those who've used it, ELSA has data on wealth for an older population specifically, but the Wealth and Asset Survey has sort of family wealth, household wealth for lots of people supposedly across the population. And it actually used to be very, very good. The last couple of rounds have been very disappointing because the quality has very notably declined. There are lots of problems, partly because of response, partly because of the way the data has been treated, partly because some of the questions changed in ways that aren't very helpful. So improvements to that, which I know the ONS is actually working on, I think is very high on my list because there's no other way to have information about wealth sort of comprehensively. Then on the admin data side, I mean, the good news is that there's more and more admin data that are becoming available. The bad news is they're still not very easily linked. And clearly, the power of being able to link these data is really important. I mean, again, you've seen the things that can be done to impute different data sets together and try to get a picture of how these things work. But actually, if you could just link those data directly, that would be much more powerful. Something, you know, I think making those data linkages more available would be important. And I think if there's like sort of one ask on the policy side, it is really about identifiers, right? We don't have, even within the tax system, we have two different identifiers, the national insurance number, the unique taxpayer reference number. Even that's not quite the full set for individuals. That's the two main things for individuals. On the firm side, there's lots of different IDs. There's just no sort of single coherent structure for how people are identified. You take the same people and put them into the NHS, they have another identifier. Put them into the justice system, there's another one. But so it makes it a very hard situation to be able to do that. It doesn't make it impossible, but you know, clearly also the process is both more difficult, more expensive, and more uncertain because you're doing basically fuzzy matching on names and addresses and various other things. And that's never going to work quite as well, particularly for some kinds of populations who have names that are very repeated effectively. And so, yeah, I think improving that data infrastructure is really important. I guess one sad thing for the UK, for those who are using it, is in principle, the integrated data service was meant to achieve that. I think something like £500 million was spent on it, and it's now been canned without any plan of further access, apart from internally to the ONS. And that is a shame because it was meant to be a way in which the data were going to be integrated, and it was going to be a service that we could externally access and use. So that is unfortunate. But I think trying to find something along those lines would be really useful. I know the government's announced a national data library. I don't think it's yet announced what that means exactly. But the fact that they're going to have something that has data in it hopefully means they're going to design something that does this process, because that's kind of crucial, I guess. That's what we need if we're going to make these data more available and more usable.
I don't really have much to add. I think the admin data asks are basically where like the biggest value gains potentially are here.
I'll ask a follow-up then. what do you think the prospects are for synthetic administrative data that can be more publicly available?
I don't really see a reason why they shouldn't produce more of it. I think the main difficulty probably is going to be convincing the different kind of government bodies or the government departments that making sure they understand why the synthetic data is not disclosive. I mean, you can clearly do it in a way that's not. But so as an example, although most of my work is with tax data, I was also involved in the program around the LEO data, which is education data linked to income data, linked to various other things. And we've been slowly trying to produce synthetic LEO that people can access, so that you can get PhD students using it, undergraduate students and master students using it. So you can get PhD students while they're waiting for their application for the real data to start sort of developing their code. It means they don't have to do everything inside the SRS. They can do the nice vibe coding of just like, I'll build my code just on this like dummy data that's kind of plausible, and then go run the real thing. And so, I mean, it also depends, are you looking for high fidelity or low fidelity synthetic data? It should just have the right structure, the right kind of shape, but it can get some things wrong. That's okay if you're just trying to develop your code and then go to the real data. But it opens up all sorts of things, because you can then have a structure, which some other countries have, where you can do all of that, and then at some point you post your code to something like the ONS, and they go run the code in their secure room and just post you back tables or figures or whatever it is you wanted. But you know what you're expecting to get out in principle. You just don't know what the answers are. But you sort of should be sure your code runs because it's the same structure of data. So that's a lower bar ask, but I think is quite has quite a high probability of working as something you could achieve, and that's what we've done with the LEO. You could also want high fidelity synthetic data where actually lots of the correlations in the data are the right ones. And then the problem is just the more variables you have to match all of those correlations to get them right, it's hard to do them in a way that you don't end up becoming somewhere potentially disclosive on some subset. You either have to be still sort of wrong for some subgroups to allow it to be sufficiently noisy, or you end up potentially having the risk that someone can't be sure that nothing could ever be disclosive in there. And I think that's the harder bar. I mean, I think if there's a way of convincing departments that it's doable, I think they'd be up for it. But I think it's just convincing them that disclosure that they're concerned about can be sort of protected against.
Well, and I'll also add, I think there's going to be a lot to learn from US and the UK and all these other countries. In the US, the IRS has been doing a project with the Urban Institute for a number of years to do, as you said, one half is a synthetic file of individual tax returns, and the second piece is a secure environment where you can run your regressions on real data, and it tracks your privacy budget. So it's a sort of, it's not exactly differential privacy, but there's some way to ensure that there's not private information being disclosed. So I think we have time for one more question if anyone has one. Yeah, Max.
I'm going to ask a provocative and heavily loaded question. Given we're talking about evidence-based analysis, and you've touched on it already about secure data, how much of a block do you think it is that the UK's approach to secure data is somewhat extreme? And do you think it's a block to evidence-based analysis?
Yeah, it's certainly the case that the UK, I think it's not even just that the UK has a very extreme situation, like in the way it treats secure data, it's that it has a completely inconsistent way of doing it, right? Like the accessibility for Ministry of Justice data around prison reoffending or some very sensitive health data, those are more easily accessible than tax returns. As someone who works on tax, I find this sort of astonishing that somehow tax returns are much scarier as a thing to potentially have concerns over, once suitably anonymized, than some of the other things that are out there. I guess it's partly a sort of culture of what different government bodies are used to in terms of their ways of engaging sort of externally. I think there's certainly some people, but probably it's always been true, who are keen to try to change things. I guess the question is, can you build critical support for it? And I think the hardest part, I think is where one always gets stuck, is it's never going to be top of the list if you're a minister. Is this like the thing you want your officials to spend time on? Is it if you're a senior official, is this the thing you're going to try and push? I mean, it's important. It has sort of a wider social benefit. It will ultimately lead to better policies if you do these things. The same as if you collect more data and better data, it will ultimately allow better policy making. But right now, people just are annoyed about it. Just as an example, we recently spoke to organization that does a lot of lobbying of government, and they were quite against some changes to that were proposed last year that were just about collecting a bit more information on tax returns. And we spoke to them about the fact that there was a different thing they were asking about, and they were saying, this would be a really good reform, it would be a really powerful reform. And we said, that sounds like a really interesting idea, but like, could you ever evidence that thing? No, because we don't collect this information. And if you hadn't been obstructing this thing last year, that would be exactly the data that we needed to be able to provide evidence. And then we'd find out whether it worked or not. It may or may not be a good idea. But without collecting some of that information, and people, are naturally sort of in the short term thinking, well, here's the cost of this thing, and not thinking, well, what is the wider benefit to the policy-making process? And if that sort of wider policy-making process is always back burner, always sort of a nice to have, it's not essential right now, because there's some fire to deal with immediately, that's what makes it hard. So I'm not going to give you, I don't have an optimistic answer of how do we get from here to there, but I think it probably just does require at some point a minister to come in who's a minister for HMRC or a minister for a particular department who just says, look, I think this is really important. I mean, it was Matt Hancock at Department for Education who was willing to agree, actually, it's important enough that this Leo data actually should be created. I'm going to sign off on people spending time helping make this data be created. If a minister came in at HMRC and said, look, I actually just think it's really important. This is going to be a part of what my legacy as a minister is. This is going to make the world, the policy environment a better place because people can have more informed discussions. They certainly could push it. It just requires one of them to say, actually, I think this is going to be on my list of top priorities.
I mean, the only thing I'll add, and I'll probably just double down a bit on provocativeness, is that I think there's a fundamental question on whether, like, risks, whether we're getting the balance right about risk averting like the worst possible outcomes with things like data versus kind of the average good that could be produced by making it more accessible. And I think that's quite a fundamental issue about whether we're getting the trade-off right, but I don't think there's an easy answer given the broad kind of constraints that we're operating in.
All right, well, Aaron, Anvar, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights today. You can follow, do follow Syntax's work and Nuffield Foundation's work. You can find them online, and we'll have another one of these soon. Thank you. Okay, so we are going to now, if my US colleagues are on, they are? Okay, excellent. We're going to rewind a little bit to our US modeling, and then we'll have one final closeout with Nikhil and myself sharing a bit about the future of policy analysis and AI within PolicyEngine, and then we'll release you all for drinks and reception. I guess we can shift over to Google Meet. And you'll now be hearing from two of my colleagues, David Trimmer, a Policy Research Fellow at PolicyEngine, and Daphne Hansel, Health Research Analyst at PolicyEngine, both of them based in the DC area. And really what they're going to be sharing is two tools that we've developed to deconstruct some really complex policies that are happening in the US. So one of them around the reconciliation bill that passed this summer, and another about some of the ramifications of an expiring policy that is also affecting Americans in a way that will not really, it's quite different from the UK because it's around our health insurance policies. So David, take it away.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is David Trimmer. I am a Policy Research Fellow here at PolicyEngine, and today I'm going to be walking you through one of our biggest projects this past year, our OBA Household by Household Explorer. So let me give you a little context. So in July, President Trump signed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which we call OBA, into law. And this bill made a number of changes to individual tax, business tax, and benefit changes. One of the big components of the bill was extending some of the expiring provisions from the 2017 tax law that Trump passed in his first term, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. These provisions included making permanent the income tax rate reductions, increasing the standard deduction, which allows households to lower their taxable income, extending and expanding the child tax credit, and making a few limitations to itemized deductions, including charitable contributions, state and local tax deduction, and mortgage interest. In addition to extending these 2017 provisions, it also made exemptions to certain types of income, which include tip, overtime, and a new auto loan deduction, as well as making a deduction for seniors over the age of 65 that they could use to lower their income tax. We model all of these individual provisions as well as some of the benefit changes in the bill. This includes adding work requirements to food stamps, also known as SNAP, which provides food assistance to lower income Americans, as well as Medicaid, which provides health insurance to lower income Americans as well. The bill also restricts immigration eligibility for certain tax credits, including the child tax credit, while also limiting eligibility for certain immigrants for food stamps, Medicaid, and the Affordable Care Act subsidies. So what we did in our new interactive is we show representative households in the form of all these different dots, and we can see how each provision affects their net income. So I'm going to switch over to our interactive posted on our website. So here we can see all these different dots, and we are dividing them by the x-axis, which shows percent change in net income, and the y-axis, which shows employment income as well. So this is a scrollable interactive, so we can scroll down and we can view how each income band is affected by these provisions. So households with income below $50,000, there's 43 million of them. And we can see that net income, 39% saw an increase in their net income, while 7% saw a reduction. And we can see all these different dots here, and we can look at specific households. So the first one that popped up is a single parent of 3 children with market income of $8,000. They actually saw a decrease in their net income of just under $900. And we can look closer at these households' composition, what type of income they had as well, while also looking at the actual provisions that they are affected by in the bill. And we saw that this household was affected by the child tax credit immigration requirements. One of the features of our interactive is you can just get a random household. So you can click this button and we get a new household of a married couple in Alabama with $28,000. And we can see they actually were not affected by this bill. In addition to clicking on a random household, you can actually just click on the interactive and you can pick one of the dots. We have a single person from North Carolina with $32,000, and they are spending $1,100. And we can see the breakdown of how they're affected by each provision. They're seeing their net income increase because of the rate adjustments, standard deduction, charitable deduction reform, and the new senior deduction, while being made worse off by the exemption repeal. We continue to scroll down. We can look at different income bands. So we can see from $50,000 to $200,000. This includes 51 million households. 88% will see a gain, while 7% will see losses. Again, we can look at households in this band. Married couple with $76,000. They see a benefit of $1,700. And again, we can see the breakdown in all of these different provisions of the bill. And we can look at even higher incomes. And one thing we've seen from this bill is that we're seeing a higher percentage of winners as we move up the income scale compared to those in the lower income range. And we can see absolute benefits also increasing for this household that we are looking at here with close to $500,000. They're seeing a $17,000 increase and seeing big gains, especially when it comes to provisions like the alternative minimum tax. So you can go through this reform or go through this interactive in more detail on our website, get some random households, pick some dots on the screen, and see how households in the United States are affected by this big reconciliation package. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Daphne, who's going to talk about US healthcare. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. So hi, my name is Daphne Hansel. I am a healthcare policy analyst at PolicyEngine US. And while I have about 7 minutes today, I'm not going to explain the entire US healthcare system to you. I am going to go over a little bit of background for, of course, our non-American audience. So the majority of Americans get their health insurance from their employers. This works where an employer will contribute a portion of the premium cost. The employee will contribute a portion of the premium cost, and this usually provides coverage for the employee's entire family. The next biggest group of Americans get their health insurance from the government because they are low income. So these are programs like Medicaid that David mentioned earlier, and CHIP, which is a children's health insurance program. These programs are run jointly by states and the federal government. The federal government pays for a majority of costs, but states implement the programs and pay a sort of substantial part of the cost as well. The next biggest program you've probably heard of is Medicare. So Medicare is our program for people over 65 or with disabilities. Now you might see this dual coverage group. This is largely low-income elderly Americans, so people who are on Medicaid and Medicare, with these health insurance programs jointly paying their health insurance costs. Then about 26 million Americans have no health insurance, and about 20 million Americans are enrolled in the marketplace, or what you may have heard of as Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. So that is actually the subject of our conversation today, as there is a big change potentially happening to the way the Affordable Care Act has been run for the past 4 years. So under the original law of the Affordable Care Act, there are only 3 variables on which health insurers are allowed to vary their price: age, zip code, and tobacco use. The subsidy people get when enrolling in the marketplace is only tied to those first 2. Eligible households are only required to spend up to a certain percentage of their household income on insurance. The premium tax credit pays the difference between that percentage and the benchmark plan in their area. In the original Affordable Care Act, households were only eligible for premium support if they made between 100 and 400% of the federal poverty line. So there's a very sharp cliff at that 400% FPL. In 2021, the American Rescue Plan created these enhanced premium subsidies for the ACA marketplace, which have been extended through the end of 2025. These enhancements remove the subsidy cliff at 400% FPL and reduce the percentage of income that households are expected to contribute towards premiums under all incomes, and it makes the premiums functionally free for the lowest income group of people eligible. And so the government shutdown is ostensibly about whether or not these enhanced subsidies should be extended. But the income rules around this and which types of families will be most affected is fairly complicated. So we built a calculator to demonstrate how this will work for families. So this calculator asks you these questions. I'm going to use an example household of a 40-year-old couple with 1 dependent that lives in Chicago. And I will click analyze, except I will.
Daphne, I think you put 10 children.
Oh, that's really funny. Sorry. Okay. I will show you the actual with 1 child that is 10. Thank you for that. But I will show you the 10-year-old child here that I've preloaded. As you can see, this takes a minute to load, or might take a minute to load, because this is analyzing this household under 2 scenarios and across a wide income range. So you can see in this chart the difference in premium tax credits if the enhanced subsidies are extended versus allowed to expire. And so you can see here the baseline versus extension. So there's a lot going on in this chart, but you can see at very low incomes, the entire family is on Medicaid, then the parents move to premium tax credit under either scenario, and then the child stays on Medicaid until I think 300% of the federal poverty line. And so you can see this largest difference here is at the cliff, where at 400% of the federal poverty line, under the baseline, so the premium tax credits are not, the enhanced credits are not extended, the household loses all eligibility. And so you can see how that affects, you can see that cliff here. And then you can see that in the marginal tax rates, which I know were mentioned earlier. So here's a marginal tax rate chart showing the current law, which is the less generous credits and the enhanced premium tax credits. And so you can also, in this chart, if you wanted to enter a specific household income, so if I enter them at 400% of the federal poverty line, you can see exactly where that would appear on the chart. And so you can see. So yeah, in the time I have, that is how the affordable care act works. And I think we have a question slide, either for myself or David.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David and Daphne. As you can see, U.S. has some complexities that are sort of going beyond what you might see in the UK, largely because of state and local tax policy, but also even the federal policies like Medicaid, CHIP, Affordable Care Act. One of the things, also Medicaid rules, eligibility depends on the state. CHIP rules depend on the state Children's Health Insurance Program. And the benchmark premiums that define the premium tax credit vary by county. So there's a lot of heterogeneity in the policies, and we've seen that the ability to simulate the whole spread of how the policies affect the country has been helpful to elucidate those, how they work. So unfortunately, also to connect to Aaron's point before, we could not do something like the household by household tool because of UK data limitations. All right, my spiel over. Any questions for David or Daphne, or in general about what's happening in the US in the policy world and how PolicyEngine is playing a part? Yeah. Great.
Hi, thanks so much. That was really interesting. So earlier, it was said that the two main points by Arun was that for evidence-based policymaking and turning this big data into evidence-based policymaking, we need the correct evidence and then that good comms interface, helping people understand. So how do you envision PolicyEngine, especially the latter point with the comms interface? What is your hope for those different people for using this data and actually translating it?
Yeah, Daphne, you want to go ahead?
Sure,
Sorry.
yeah. I mean, I am hopeful that people could use the tool that we have to figure out their own health insurance costs, right? Like you can enter your own household and see how your very real health insurance costs would change next year under the various laws. I mean, I know a ton of work was done around the election as well to try and, show how candidates' policies would affect your own household. We try and get as much reach and traction on these tools as possible, I think is sort of the main answer.
Add to that, I think it's been part of our ethos since the beginning to not just say democratizing policy by making our tools accessible, but also by making them more personal. So a lot of the coverage, basically all the coverage I think that I saw of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act looked at aggregates, which are important. I mean, what's the impact by income decile? What's the overall cost of the program by provision? But by bringing it down to an individual household, now you can sort of help policymakers understand. And those are all representative households. It's not made up out of thin air, what the real potential impacts are on individual households.
Hi. I was just interested to know, I mean, we were speaking to some of the people earlier, like there isn't anything quite like PolicyEngine in the UK. Are there more tools like yours in the States? Is there more sort of competition and that can do other things as well that I guess you can learn from and bring back over here?
Yeah, David and Daphne. Daphne maybe on the health side, how it compares, and David more broadly.
Yeah, so quickly on the health side, there are some other models that do similar things to PolicyEngine, but none are open source or transparent, basically. I mean, so the Kaiser Family Foundation has tools where you can look at specifically your own health insurance costs under different situations, but they don't have anything from the sort of like aggregate perspective. So you couldn't look at both the reform on your own level and look at society-wide implications. It's not particularly customizable. And then the Urban Institute has probably the state-of-the-art healthcare microsimulation model, but it is incredibly gated. They use it for research. They produce excellent research, but it is not accessible to anyone who does not want to contract with them for research use on it. So yeah, this is, and it's in healthcare somewhat unique.
Yeah, I would say like there's several, policy-oriented nonprofits, and several of them release tools that allow people to, especially in the lead up to reconciliation, there were several organizations that either released reports looking at different options that could have been included in the reconciliation package. Some even released tools where people could customize what kind of tax package they wanted, but you can never go deeper. You can never customize those provisions. You can never see the data that was really fueling them. And I think that's what sets PolicyEngine apart, is we really try to make everything transparent and open source and allow people to customize so they can really see the impact of these policies and any of the ideas that come up.
I also do want to credit our fiscal sponsor in the US. We're working on establishing an independent nonprofit. It's called the PSL Foundation. And one of their main projects is called Tax Calculator, which is, they have a dash, so it's like a product, not just a thing. But, and that was the first open source tax microsimulation model in the US. It only covers federal taxes, but it was actually, before I got into policy, I worked in technology, I worked at Google, and I was just kind of wanting to try out some of these models. And I found this open source tool that I could use. And then I started playing around with some ideas like child tax credit reform, and then reforming, adjusting the code and becoming a contributor. And that's sort of what got me into this path. So we do believe in open source as a way to bring in new talent in addition to engaging the public as users. And since then, we're still the only open source model that captures tax and benefit programs. One of the things that's also in the OBA household by household tool, some of these federal programs actually affect state taxes, and we calculate those downstream impacts that are sort of mechanical. But now the Budget Lab at Yale is also created, and from the beginning, they also made their data pipelines and their federal microsimulation model open source. So we're really excited to see that there's a broader movement toward transparency, even as, I think we're still paving the way. We still have the only openly available web app that lets you do all the things that Anthony showed. Time for maybe one more question if anyone has one on the US side. Okay, well, thank you again, David and Daphne. We're gonna move into our final talk today, which is on AI-powered policy analysis. So I'll bring Nikhil back to the stage here. And yeah, this is, so we might run a couple minutes over, but we'll get you to drink soon. And just want to return, oh, sorry, can we go back to the, okay, great. Want to return to sort of how we're thinking about AI, right? In the opening session, we talked about how we're using it for building software, for improving our models with machine learning models like quantile regression forest, imputation, gradient descent, all the stuff that I think Aaron or Anvar said definitely do not talk about. And then finally, for augmenting our software with using AI as part of it. So now we're sort of moving even more. And this is one domain where, has anyone used, okay, show of hands. Who's used ChatGPT? Okay. How about Claude? Okay. How about Gemini? I guess just round out. All right. Who's used coding agents? So this could be either Claude Code, Codex, Gemini CLI. Okay. Who does coding in general as part of your work? Okay, great. Okay. These tools will change your life if you're doing any coding, even if you don't do coding. I think there are ways to use these tools There are agents that run on your computer, so you can have the power of these AI models not just once, right? Not just saying, okay, I want this chat response and I want to like fill in a document. No, this can run, create a file, create another file, create a whole set of files, create a whole project. This is the way that humans interact by building up projects, right? Piece by piece, and with feedback loops. It can figure out, okay, here's a program I wrote, but I actually want to improve it in this way. I'm going to write a mechanism to make sure I did it right, and then continue to develop until it's achieving all the ends I want. So this is the power of what Cloud Code delivers. And our colleague Vahid actually just wrote a blog post showing how we're using what's called a plugin to develop this more fully. Do you want? Yeah, okay. Okay, we're going to skip the demo for today. But actually, Vahid, why don't you just come up here and talk about how you've used Cloud Code plugin, what it is, and how you use it in policy research.
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, in the team we are discussing about how we can automate most of the taxes that we have. And we are thinking about, okay, what if we have, for example, 10 array in our team, and how we can distribute the tasks among them. For example, we have a nice blog post here. I mean, I can walk through the blog post. Basically, with Cloud Code, you can just have a kind of extension in your VS Code. So basically, in a terminal command, if you are familiar with VS Code, you can import a kind of ChatGPT in your VS Code and just directly chat with that kind of plugin and have a kind of conversation with that and trying to build a module. This module could be a kind of creating new files, writing transcripts, reading the files. And with that, you can have, for example, different like array to do your tasks. So basically, most of us is just, we are trying to code with ChatGPT, and most of the time we are copy-pasting between the tabs, switching between the tabs, and trying to copy-paste the text. And what if the Cloud Code, the ChatGPT, can have access to all of your programs, to all of your projects? And then, based on that, you can chat with kind of chat box and trying to facilitate your coding in a way that, as I said, it has a kind of control to all of your programs. So it has a better understanding. It can add some unit tests to that. And also, at the next stage, we just thought about, OK, we want to distribute the tasks, OK? And with Cloud Code, you can just write different agents. So you can have some AI agents. And based on that, when you are communicating with that agent, with the AI, it's actually automatically understand which AI agents is needed with your task that you have, and trying to distribute those kind of tasks to the AI agents that you have built before. And after that, you can have like one AI agent for just writing the scripts, one AI agent for producing the results, one AI agent for producing the report. And after that, you can have a kind of independent AI agent for just reviewing, no matter the other AI agents is doing. And yeah, we are gathering all of these AI agents, and also a new tool in Cloud Code they called skills. You can see the skills like, for example, you want to build a report, but you don't want to actually copy-paste your format and your layout all of the times that you're building something. So you can save these kind of things as an MD file, just writing an MD file, talking with the ChatGPT like that, okay? And you can save those kind of skills for your projects. And after that, you can save all of these skills and AI agents into one plugin. So imagine, previously companies produced like Python packages, and the VS Code is moving toward the interface for different plugins for different projects. And we have a plugin, PolicyEngine plugin for the Cloud Code, and yeah, I'll pass it to Max to talk about that. But yeah, happy to discuss after the presentation.
Thank you, Fahid. Yeah, I think, think of this as he said, of suppose you had 10 research assistants at your disposal. They all have different types of skills. Some of them are better at coding, some of them are better at writing, some of them are great at editing or reviewing the theory, right? So this is, I think yeah. So what this plugin infrastructure allows you to do is have a set of skills where you can imbue different agents with different combinations of skills, and then you can invoke them with these custom commands. So, at future, we'll do a webinar where we sort of go through what this looks like. But just, you can create a new agent here. This is Vahid's blog post. So he made a fetcher to fetch the information about the policy, a script writer, which is the coder, and then the report generator. And you can create these agents. And now you see it's very fun. It's got all these different colors. So all of these are being invoked now, these different agents. And you can actually invoke them in parallel even. So you have maybe one agent that's writing the code, another that's writing the tests. You can have those operate independently so that they're not biasing each other through their initial implementation. And then you can sort of put it all together. So, oops. We're taking a scientific approach to deploying this for improving our own software, and we hope you'll all enjoy using this once we launch it fully. In the US, we have dozens, maybe hundreds of additional policies that we want to encode. So for example, cash welfare programs that vary depending on the state. We want to make sure that that's credibly implemented. So, but we want to have AI do this in a way we can be sure is safe. So the way we're doing this is we're creating first what we're calling a golden pull request. So this is a set of code that we've implemented ourselves, that we've confirmed meets the needs and accurately represents the code that we're the program that we're implementing. Then we're using our Claude Code plugin, all those agents and skills, to come up with a specific flow. So the flow might be first pull down the policy documents, the statutes, the regulations, policy manuals, tax forms, anything that could be useful for encoding that policy. That's going to be one. Another is going to be actually doing the encoding. Another writing the tests. Another bringing it all together, making sure that it really comports with all of our guidelines. And see how close the AI gets start to finish. We're not having like manual, okay, do this, do this, do this. We're going to give it one command to say, implement this entire policy from scratch. And then another AI is going to compare it to the golden pull request. So we'll be able to see how accurately does the AI actually implement this. If it's bad, we'll go back to the drawing board, continue to improve all the instructions, those agents, those skills, everything that goes into PolicyEngine Claude. That's going to be part of our sort of reinforcement learning approach to making sure that eventually we will get to a place where we can be confident that this can update things start to finish, to Jess's earlier question about how we make this sustainable. So we're very excited about that. Okay, so that's developing software. Now, the next piece, we're on the local area modeling. You heard our colleague Ben talk about the approaches we're taking. I won't rehash the L0 penalty and all that. But suffices to say, this actually enables, I think, some novel types of policy research we can do in the UK as well, because we'll finally be able to understand how changes in, for example, local housing allowance are representing and affecting people across constituencies and local authorities. So very excited to bring that together and to expand it further. So in the US, our Social Security system is a trust fund kind of approach, and it's going to expire in the next decade. So it's very important for us to be able to simulate Social Security models. And the organization Daphne mentioned before, Urban Institute, they're the only ones who have an externally available Social Security simulator pension model. So and it's not available to the public. You have to pay for using it. So we're excited to bring together the local area modeling, some of the synthetic work that Vahid's been working on, sort of all these different approaches to construct a synthetic panel where you can track people over the course of their lifetime and also make sure that that forecasts their future earnings growth. And we'd love to do this in the UK as well. It's less of a pressing need, but this is sort of an additional way that we're going to use machine learning to inform public policy. Okay, and then to wrap it all up, Nikhil is going to show us how we're bringing in AI to App V2.
Thanks, Max. Hold on 1 second. One hand. Thank you. Okay, so moment of truth. So I think all of the stuff we've said before about like a scientific approach to basically developing our own software, like improving the model, things like that, is sort of one half of the way that we are using. Interesting. Using particularly large language models to kind of make stuff easier to use. A particular second way is on the sort of accessibility front, because obviously, using LLMs to build sort of tax benefit modeling is good because it gives you sort of more accuracy in the model, but it doesn't really help you make that model easier to use or be able to reach more people. And so we have been thinking quite a lot about how do we integrate large language models to basically make the problem of I have a question about tax benefit policy, how much would this raise, how would it affect the poverty rates, to be able to get to an answer. Obviously, the sort of really the kind of golden results that we've been thinking about for probably a couple of years at this point is that you just go from question to answer. And I think we're kind of moving in that direction. But we'll definitely very much welcome everyone's sort of thoughts on that kind of question. So here's one possible way that this could look and that we've been kind of working towards. So for example, in our new version 2 of the app, you've got sort of policies, you've got dynamics, you've got different data sets, and you've got simulations. You've got all of these sort of pieces. And so then what we were thinking of was, can we use AI large language models to basically make this a lot more like talking to a model in terms of using it, rather than sort of fiddling with the switches yourself. Like, can you just ask the question of, I want to see how this policy reform affects people by age group, rather than having to select from a predefined kind of list of things. So can we kind of build that extensibility just with large language models? And what it would kind of look like could be something like this. So you create an individual report. You've got a load of different sort of SQL queries that are part of that report. And then we've basically prompted large language models to create the charts, create the visualizations, create the tables from that data. So for example, what I could do is I could look at different income tax options. And I could select simulations. And I could go, I want to look at these simulations. I want to look at income, tax, and I want to select the variable that I want to look at. And then let's say total of income tax under each simulation, and create analysis. And so then we can basically use large language models to pass, queries from people who might not really know what exactly their question maps to in terms of the actual code, or maybe it doesn't exactly match to a template, but we can probably still handle it. So for example, you've got, under different scenarios, total income tax revenue in 2029, I think. And we've basically mapped their question into a SQL query of data that we've simulated using our model. And what we could do is, give them flexibility to basically just, visualize the data in however format they want, to basically give people as close as possible a starting point to launch off for anyone writing an analysis in any kind of format. So for example, here you've got, total tax revenue under baseline, a lowered personal allowance, and a personal allowance that's just been removed completely. So, I don't have to ask for a bar chart. I could ask for a markdown table. I could specify what I want the columns and the rows to be. At the end of the day, this is basically the same as just sort of putting stuff into Claude or ChatGPT. So for example, I can see these different scenarios and sort of see the percentage change in tax revenues. So basically just trying to think about what are the things we could build to like make things a lot closer to the sort of final report writing stage, while cutting out as much of the kind of just admin of, I need to change this number now, things like that, to try and cut down time. So that's kind of just a sort of preview of things that we've been working on. And with that, I'll pass back to Max.
Okay, so that was the grand finale, by the way. I mean, pretty cool, right? Being able to construct entire reports through the language that we all use to talk to our colleagues. And so we are, as you can tell, very excited, very bullish about AI. In terms of its promise for policymaking, we see this as a way to not just trivially sort of cut down the time, but a way to respond to the most pressing challenges that society faces and that AI could contribute to, right? I mean, if AI transforms society as quickly as some experts think it could, policymakers are going to have a lot of economic and societal change to respond to very quickly. That means they're going to need epistemic tools, quantitative tools, tools that understand the human and lived experience of people in a representative way, in a way that they haven't before. So we want to meet that challenge and do it with all of you to make sure that we can establish the evidence base and all the systems that we need to make sure that we do respond to those accurately. So again, this is an invitation. I want to thank you all for joining us today and sort of hearing about what we're building, what tools we are currently looking to empower the policy community with. I invite you to join our community, use the tools, join our Slack workspace. We've got trainings and more things coming up. But this is a unique opportunity, I think, to take advantage of a real transformation in policy and society. I want to also just, if you haven't met them already, I think, speak with my colleagues, Vahid, Anthony, and Nikhil at the reception. And yeah, let's stay in touch. So thank you again so much for coming, and see you at over drinks. Field Foundation for supporting this.